Hey there YouTube, and welcome to Ask a Maestro. Today's video is part of an interview series that I have been conducting with musicians in the field, people who are finding ways to make their careers through music. Today's guest is my friend Gabriel Lefkowitz. Gabe is a violinist, a composer, and a conductor. Right now he is simultaneously serving as the concertmaster of the Knoxville, Tennessee Symphony, as well as the Louisville Orchestra in Kentucky. Gabe and I had a great time talking, and in fact we had so much to discuss between his career as a violinist and as a composer that I've broken our conversation up into two different videos. So today we are going to hear Gabe talk about his work as a composer, mainly of music for video games. We started off talking about how he got into writing music for video games in particular, and how that grew out of his love for music for film.
From maybe high school age, I was really interested in film music. First of all, because I loved the music I was hearing and the films I was into, and I'm a huge nerd, so Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Star Trek, all of that is very much up my alley, and I loved the music. And I also went to the Boston Pops frequently, and I saw the power over audiences that music has. So I wanted to write film music. I realized at a certain point that even in film, unless you're at the top of the film composing industry, you're probably not going to be writing music for space opera or fantasy epics. And so I realized that the video game genre, a studio doesn't need to be that rich or have that many resources to create a game in that genre. So I could enter into the workforce as a video game composer and immediately start writing the type of music I wanted to write. Well, like in almost every musical pursuit, the market is completely oversaturated with folks doing it at a very high level. So it's very hard to come up with a new idea or fill a niche that hasn't already been filled. So I realized early on that no one was going to come to me with an offer of work, but a good resource was crowdfunding campaigns. So initially, I wrote a demo, basically a demo CD's worth of music. And that was about 4 pieces in different styles. One was a kind of jaunty Viking epic main title. One was an imagining of a space battle, like something from Star Trek or Star Wars. And the third was a more subtle kind of introspective piece. And the fourth was for a role-playing game it imagined in Enchanted Forest. So I wrote those 4 pieces. I spent my own money and got them produced, which means I recorded aspects of them live and had it mixed and mastered. Then I went on Kickstarter and I messaged hundreds of people. And actually, because I had a job on the side, or rather I should say my primary job was as concertmaster of the Knoxville Symphony, I was in a fortunate position to have income, and I used some of that to hire an assistant to message people for me. I wrote the template of a message. I'm embarrassed to say it read something like, "Hello, my name is such and such, I do such and such. I'm really impressed with your game, blank, and I especially like about your game that blank." And so that was my assistant's task, to fill in those things, personalize an email, and then send my demo along. Let's say I messaged 300 people. Maybe 75 of them, to their credit, were nice enough to respond that they did not need any help. So 75 responded that they were all set. Maybe 5 of 300 responded with any interest, and maybe 3 or 4 of those worked out. Now that was in my first, I would say, 6 months of starting out and dedicating time to this. And from that, really 2 projects followed through and I wrote music for them. I wasn't as big a console gamer as a lot of my friends. The only system I ever owned was a Nintendo 64, so I had a lot of friends playing Xbox and PlayStation. I never owned those or really dove too deeply into them. But computer games I was a big fan of, and they have some great music, these early computer games, as do the Nintendo games. There seems to be this whole industry of fantastic Japanese composers from the 70s, 80s, and 90s who, in addition to writing very catchy music, they're obviously very well trained. These people are studied and probably went to conservatories. And in my first couple of gigs, I charged a very low rate because I was so desperate to have something that I could then use to leverage other opportunities. And to be honest, one of the difficulties is that, well, I'm extremely proud of the music I've written, especially for this game, Pop-Up Dungeon. At this point, maybe I've written half an hour of music, but games take a long time to produce. And while I am so proud of the work I have done on it and can share the tracks, I can't really get notoriety in the video game industry until the game is released and people see how it functions within the game and how successful the game itself was. I would like to think it can only help to be attached to a good game. Let's say the game ends up being terrible and is a flop. It's not really like being a Hollywood actor, involved in a flop, or a writer or producer who makes a flop. People don't look up your background in that way and say, well, you wrote this music that really flopped for this game. But what it means to fail or to struggle in the industry is not necessarily to be attached to a bad project. It's just to not be attached to a project at all and to have people not know your name. So the either or is either you're working or you're not. So imagining a role-playing game where the user is controlling a character that walks around some world. The main difference between video game music and film music is that your structure is already determined in film music. You have a scene, moments in the film that you have to hit with the music, and things obviously sync. In video games, generally, you need to write loops in general because you have no idea how long the player is going to remain in one world or one level of the game. They could, press the pause button and eat a Hot Pocket or something. So you have no idea how long someone's going to spend, and obviously the music can't just run out. So you write a loop where the end becomes the beginning. But also in terms of the arc of the music, you can't necessarily write a piece of music that starts softly and subtly and turns into something warlike and epic, because you don't know what the character is going to be doing at any given point during your track of music. And maybe they'll be reading a menu or picking up and reading about the effects of some spell, and you'll have huge, crazy, epic music going on, and then they'll be fighting a monster and you'll have nothing going on. So you have to be sensitive to that, and you have to resist the urge to write music that really has a definitive narrative arc, which isn't to say that the music flatlines, but whatever you're writing has to work for all possible situations of what a character might be doing. Yeah, to really develop the tech chops, it's amazing what people with the ability can do. Not everyone has to record live in the way that I do. In fact, I do that because I haven't really had the time, or will in some ways, to develop my technical abilities on the computer to really understand how to space things correctly and how to use reverb and all these other effects to create something that sounds realistic. But I have friends who do it extremely well, and when you listen to who's successful out in the industry, you hear people who the music's not that interesting, but it's so well produced that it certainly does the job, and there's a lot to be said for that, because it's serving the vision of someone else. This is not your artistic creation. Hopefully there are the days, and many of them, where it's fulfilling and you feel like you are being artistic. But in terms of getting a career going, there's some good, articles online, how to get your first gig, but it has a lot to do with putting yourself out there, cold calling, developing a very strong demo. You might need to spend a little bit of money up front, and certainly a lot of time learning your craft. And when you feel like you're in a place where you can do the job and do it well, you got to put yourself out there, network as much as possible. There are a lot of game developer conferences. Go there with a stack of CDs, hand them out, and expect a very low rate of return on the number of people you contact. But on the plus side, you only need one gig at a time, maybe two. So of course there's a whole different approach, which is to apply for work at a major studio or being an assistant to a major composer. And that's kind of a different route. But I know, for example, in film, a lot of people do that. They go to a program like the USC Scoring for Motion Pictures and Television program, which is very expensive. They don't offer scholarship. It's probably like $45,000 at this point. But you'll meet people in the industry and maybe get hired as an assistant after that. So, but you might very well be writing the music that goes in a major motion picture and not getting the credit for it, which is part of the issue. But you're certainly going to do a lot of menial work, from getting coffee and cleaning up the studio to even on the computer cleaning up
audio
MIDI or audio. And the idea would be to slowly climb the ranks there and be given more and more responsibility, and maybe at some point branch out on your own and get your own gigs. And people do it successfully. Actually, what you were saying also reminds me of in the golden age of Hollywood music studios where everything was in-house, you had a lot of people who got their start by being copyists. I think nowadays we think about fulfillment a lot more than they did in our, the age of our grandfathers, where people were just more interested in making a living. And in some ways it's nice, and in some ways it's a harder thing to experience, especially with Facebook, when you see all the wonderful things all your friends are doing and how successful they are and how lovely their Hawaiian beaches. It's tough because you're constantly assessing yourself and thinking, how successful am I compared to other people? Am I fulfilled? Whereas a couple generations ago, it was enough to be working.
Right.
I can't really see in video game music anyone fully supporting themselves on that alone. Let's say you get out of college and you have all the means in the world to do it. There are very few people who really make their living primarily doing that. So you might have another musical job. You might play in a band at a church. I know some people who do that, or do this or that or other non-musical things. The other thing I would say is that video games are still not as lucrative as films and television. So I have a friend who writes a lot of low-budget films for the Sci-Fi Channel and Lifetime, and the fees are decent, but he really makes his money on the back end. The royalties are pretty good, and every time that gets play on TV, that's what's really supported him over the last years. And I don't think, unless you're working on major budget games, most indie games are not really interested in profit sharing, unless you can work out some deal where the initial fee is low to non-existent and just go in for share of the profits.
Yeah.
But then, there's so many games which kind of fizzle out that you might be working on, so it's a dangerous thing. I worked out a deal with this game where I would get a share of the soundtrack sales, and it remains to be seen how well the soundtrack sells, because actually their last soundtrack did sell pretty decently. And that would certainly, help supplement the fact that, I spent many, many hours of my life on this game, and the fees were decent. But probably if I worked out the money to the hours spent, it would come out to a little less than minimum wage. But I was willing to do it because that's what it took to get my first gig. Okay, and I learned a lot doing it. So it's an ever-evolving industry.
Okay, YouTube, that is it for this episode of Ask a Maestro. These interviews will continue to come, but in the meantime, please do put your questions about classical music in the comments below. Feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, go play an instrument, sing a song, or write your very own video game score. And until then, goodbye, everyone.